Joy. The window-shaped box of honeyed sunlight crept its way up the body, incrementally traversed the length of the bed with a warming caress, and met his smile with a kiss. Wrapped in the innocence of sleep, smoky tendrils of dreams taking leave for the day, John seemed every inch the peaceful, content Buddha in a blanket. As the earthly world beckoned him from dreamland, gently nudging him awake, the beatific smile only broadened. A new day opened its arms and folded him into a loving embrace, and his face shone more brightly than the new sun that woke him. Shrugging off the cowl of sleep, he breathed deeply of the morning, sucking huge draughts of the world inside. He was the happiest man in the world. That John woke and lived with such joy was not so surprising. That others didn't perplexed him. The complexity of his very being so overwhelmed him and filled him with an awe and respect for the Creator that his life was lived in his honor. He cast off the bedclothes and stood naked at the window. The city below had already yawned and rubbed the sleep from its eyes and was abuzz with people, in cars and buses, in shoes, in hats, in love. It all worked so well. People needed air to breathe, and air was there. It rained the water we needed to drink. Plants and animals were in plentiful supply for food. How could anyone not live in gratitude of God's wondrous plan? He gave us wisdom, knowledge, the ability to fend for ourselves. If the weather turned inclement, he gave us animals to skin, stones to build with, hands to fashion, and minds to create the mortar. The city was a monument to his gifts. John reached out of the window to touch life, felt it touch him back, and shivered with a thrill. He watched nature and technology, which was itself born of man's mind, which in turn was born of nature, and therefore natural, shake hands under a gray-orange shawl that turned to an icy blue, scudded with cotton candy. He saw the street below, and craned his neck to see the towers of the skyscrapers that were built to raise the level of the earth to meet him. It made him smile. Life made him smile. He was filled with joy. He became aware of the life around him. First, of course, the teeming masses on the street and behind the windows around him. Then the pets, the dogs, cats, and gerbils. The moths in his closet, the ants in the pantry that had no right to his lucky charms. They were obvious and evident. But he was aware, too, of the invisible life around him, the microbes, the germs, the little one-celled beasties that he was no doubt breathing in and out of his own body now. He was happy to host them, celebrated their house party inside him. It tickled, made him laugh. Just standing naked as a newborn in the eye of God, a bright light to the moths of life, sent an electrical charge through his body that prickled his skin and gooseflesh and shrank his scrotum so tight that his testicles grunted in protest. He knew he could be seen by anyone who chose to peer beyond the 8th-floor window, and the thought renewed the delightful shiver. There was nothing dirty about the vessels we'd been given. They were beautiful, adorned or unadorned. Besides, his penis was mostly hidden by his girth. The thought of his penis made him aware of his suddenly overwhelming need to urinate. As he relieved himself in the superhero peanut butter jar, he marveled anew at the human mechanism. We eat, we drink, our systems process it, and reject what we don't need. The miracle of elimination, experienced on such regular occasions, gave him so many opportunities to thank the Creator for the blessed life he lived. He filled the jar with hot gold thanks and walked it over to the window and poured it onto the thriving marigolds, making steam in the morning coolness. "This is for you," John said to heaven, "with all of my love." Suddenly stroked by the brisk morning's fingers, John slipped into loose-fitting clothing and out of his tight-fitting room. The child of God walked among the people, and they were oblivious to his love. But John didn't need to speak his love to them. It radiated from his every pore. He was but a cell in the massive creature that inhabited the earth. He was a part of the machine he'd created in his image, and so were the others. Where was their joy? How could their every thought, their every waking moment not be dedicated to the euphoric appreciation of his bond, his will, his glory? It lay all about them as it did about him. Everywhere one looked, even with closed eyes, he was present, his magical, wonderful plan ubiquitous and evident. He could hardly keep from laughing out loud with the joy. But them. They were joyless, empty husks, littering the planet with their worthlessness. He was immediately sorry for the thought that anything he created was worthless, and he didn't really mean that. It's just that they should be more grateful, that's all. He felt guilty. He was surrounded by them, a cherub bobbing in a sea of expressionless faces. When they did flash expression, it was invariably anger, hate, viciousness. Faces on fire with resentment barked and howled and spat at one another, and he knew when night fell it would only be worse. Under the blanket of darkness they scurried off into secret places, groping, tasting, using, and fighting one another, rending the night with flashes of gunfire, the glint of knives, a river of life flowing into the soil at their feet. And he let them do it. He gave them the choices, but they had to make them. And so John walked among them, loving them through their hatred, giving them his life. But all they gave him were their backs. The little round man in the ill-fitting clothes might well have been the invisible man for all the notice he was given. He knew he wasn't the sort of man who solicited looks, but he looked at them, marveling at their magnificence and variety. They were an endless array of artful flesh sculpture, and they didn't seem to even know it. And he wasn't handsome really, but he was pleasant enough. And certainly they could feel the joy he generated. Perhaps it was the scars that made them not really look away, since they never looked in the first place. They weren't disfiguring, they were barely noticeable pale lines etched on his face and body. But even though he moved through them like an unwelcome virus, he knew they shared the planet, the organism, and he was, as ever, at peace. His face, despite the thin white lines, was innocent, ageless, rosy, and devoid of the crevices left by a life lived. He could be in his 30s or his 60s, it was hard to tell. But he was 46. But even though his innocent sweetness and love were ignored, they would continue to be broadcast. He was in love with them all, these walking, talking, hearing parts of God's body. He wanted to crush them in his embrace, smother them with the love and passion he felt for them, feel flesh against flesh in an act of global communion, feeling the blood of life coursing through their bodies together. But all he could do was watch them. Even though he couldn't hear them, he knew people whispered about him behind his back. Even that made him smile. Everyone else had the mechanism that allowed hearing. It was ordinary, everyday, average. But John was special. He had been chosen to possess twisted clots of solid flesh in place of the cochlea. He didn't have to hear all of the ugliness multiplying around him. Words could never hurt him. They could say what they pleased, but they couldn't steer him from living his life for the one who counted. He'd never hear them fire their hateful guns, their lovers' quarrels, their corruption of their limitless gifts. No, it was chosen that he should not hear. His head was wrapped in celestial, blissful cotton, and even a nuclear blast would go unnoticed. When he spoke, which was rare, his deaf man baby talk earned him special treatment. Speaking made people overplay their acts of kindness. He would ask the lady in the convenience store for an Annabelle's Rocky Road, and she would puff and coo with a big waxy red smile about how they were the best, and sometimes he didn't have to pay for it. He knew people thought he was stupid because he was deaf, but he wasn't. He knew the truth, and that made him smarter than all the others. And he got to be deaf. John walked the same way every day, up and down the city streets by rote. His route was automatic, mindless, unchanging, yet no one ever noticed him despite the 20-some years of regularity. His first stop was always the schoolyard. The joyful innocence of children brought him the closest to God. Their newness and freshness and incompleteness gave him hope and filled him with passion. Winter was best, because when they played foursquare or tetherball or hopscotch or dodgeball, the sight of their breath in the chill air coming out of their little bodies delighted him. Seeing the blood rise to crimson their cheeks thrilled him. Though he couldn't hear their exuberant cries as he clutched the chain links of the fence, he could feel their energy, their youth, their life. He wanted to play too. But he just watched. To John, watching was participating. He was with them on the broken blacktop, skinning his knees and flushing cherry bombs down the toilets. His joyous reverie had its own peculiar deaf man's music, swelling his head with its cadences. His heart pounded a march that he shared with them and gave him hunger. But his heartbeat fluttered when he saw the new girl. He thought it was Angela at first, but even he knew that wasn't possible. If Angela were still alive, she'd be nearly his size now. But she was with him now, and had been for nearly 3 decades. Of course, he could have given her back to him, but John knew he didn't work that way. Besides, the new girl's eyes were brown. Angela's ice-water eyes were the first thing anyone noticed about her. They had a depth and serenity that belied her 5 years. He could see heaven in her eyes. 2 years her senior, he'd been in love with his sister since her birth, teaching her the piggy game when she was a baby, helping Daddy give her a bath, teaching her to walk, and sharing a room with her. He saw Angela and the new girl, and the house came back for the first time in years. The little house with Daddy's room, Johnny and Angela's room, the kitchen, and best of all, the concrete patio with the cardboard pick sweet train on the other side of the sliding glass door. He'd just finished painting her name on the engine when he used his Jerry Mahoney dummy to call her to see. She never hesitated. From the bathroom, her bright-eyed grin leading the way, she ran to her special big brother and through the sliding glass door. It was a spectacular crash, and he didn't even take cover as it rained shards of glass which shattered into smaller prismatic crystals as it hit the concrete, showering her in rainbows of colored light as she stood before him in shock. She was motionless, uncomprehending on the patio, staring pool-eyed and questioning at him as an atlas of crimson highways slowly appeared across her face. He watched her ice-water eyes go crimson as she spilled red lava tears down her face. She wilted before him into a pool of her own blood, slowly taking leave of John's world. She got to be with him, and John didn't. And though he couldn't hear it, John knew the bell had rung because when he returned from the pool of Angela, the playground was empty, and the new girl was gone. And so he continued to walk. His hand brushed his face, and he could feel a few random spiky whiskers reaching from his skin. There weren't many, and he never considered shaving them. That would be an affront to the Creator. And he wanted to see them. He'd never cut his hair since his parents died. He'd never had the need. It had all fallen out on the day of the accident. Even his brows and eyelashes. His body was as hairless as a newborn's, but just in the last couple of weeks there was a trace of a beard. He wandered into the subterranean public restroom, breathing deep of the natural scent of man as he entered. It was a real, unalterably natural scent that couldn't be hidden with deodorizers and perfume. He liked that. He didn't like chemicals. As a wino kneeled in confession in front of the porcelain altar, John stood in front of the mirror, his image shivering in the flickering neon light. He could see his beard and counted 27 hairs, not just dark pores, but actual hairs on his face. The neon light made the tiny white scars on his face stand out, and he raised his pudgy fingers to trace them. They were artfully random, almost like the decorations carved into the faces of African tribesmen. He liked to feel them, and his sensitive fingers caressed the slightly raised lines with love and devotion. He ran his long thumbnail across the numb lines and found a new space under his eyebrows. Hooking the nail under the hairless brow, he cut into his flesh and drew the nail across the brow beneath the skin like opening a letter. He repeated the cut under his other brow, and his eyes were awash with his blood. He leaned over the sink and let it dribble down the drain where it would eventually meet his maker. "I love you," John told God as he gave him his blood, letting it drool into the basin until it congealed on his face. Then he cleaned up, blotting the new wounds with toilet paper and heading back into the sunlight. Back on Earth, John imagined the sounds of the birds and the truck's air horns and the chattering of mankind, invented sounds for them in his mind as he melded with the world. He could grant them any sound and chose colors for them. The old woman was surely talking a blue streak, and the silent squawk of the crow that sat and shat in the tree overhead almost certainly purple. The blast of the Mack truck that almost crushed the bicycle had to be red. Deep, dark, blood red. Crimson. He never chose a path. Every day John let himself into the world and let its tide drift him where it would. Today its pattern was as random as any. It took him to school, to the park, and eventually to church. He stopped in front of the church. Made him laugh. He watched the old lady scurrying in and out of the mouth of man's massive testament to himself. They struck him as germs being breathed by the church. They built these monstrous gargoyles of guilt so they could celebrate their lives with he who granted them life for what, maybe an hour a week? John just could not understand their selfishness. Who needed to build a temple when there was no escaping its edifice? To merely be alive was to be worshipping at God's feet. These rationalizers, excuse makers, mere men with their holy Bible and their curly-cued architecture were beside the point. It was so obvious. The invisible man grew corporeal, unable to keep from chuckling at the folly of mankind, and faces turned to look at him as they skittered past, self-consciously racing into the church, eyes pink with tears, rheumy with age and regret, clouded by cataracts they'd hoped he'd rescind. They wanted to give back their gifts. He watched a young mother and her infant skittishly approach the church, and he stopped smiling. The baby magnetized him with the perfection and innocence that came with the new child warranty. Their eyes connected. Mommy turned to see what made her baby stare so. John was not used to having attention paid to him when he was watching others. His mouth hung slack and dumb as he saw the baby's tomato face brighten and balloon into a toothless grin. Mom flushed with a proud smile at him, but he didn't see it. He and the baby both had expressions that climaxed with saliva drooling from the shiny lower lip. The baby laughed, gleefully acknowledging another unformed, unstructured, incomplete flesh sculpture, and the wide baby's mouth made John gasp in horror. He never expected to see teeth in the infant's mouth, but he did expect a roof. Inside, where you would expect soft pink membranes hooding the mouth, there was a gaping black cavern. If the child had had no chin, he could coochie-coo her all the way through her cleft palate to her soft little brain. Though she was at least 50 feet away, John's hands reached instinctively up as if to caress this special chosen child. Mother reared like a skittish pony and whisked her daughter into the church. After reeling in the sunshine for what must have only been a minute, but felt like a good chapter of his life, John walked with lumpen disorder into a church for the first time. It was a little different from what he had expected. Not nearly so grand or ethereal. It was scuffed and a little grimy, more earthly and real than he had anticipated, with the patina of life all about him. But he was taken aback by the vertiginous height of the ceiling overhead. The sun draped him with images of stained glass angels. Jesus Christ himself, bleeding from his crown of thorns, lay across his back. Unaware of the whispered prayers that drifted smokily through the church, John wandered up and down the pews, eyes to heaven, forgetting for a moment what brought him in. It was a grotesque manse, founded on fear and obedience, delighting in meting out violent punishment for breaking the sacrament. This was no palace of love and devotion. His God did not live here. He glanced round at the frightened little mice who lit their candles. This was the home of their last hope, not their first. With his heightened sense of smell, John breathed the stench of death, of decay, of hopelessness. It was a joyless building. He didn't want to be here. But then he saw the baby again. It had been watching him since his entry, and he had not even been aware, despite the sixth sense that had linked them. Mommy was kneeling, lighting a candle, and didn't notice the silent communication going on. John stared at the child with wide, loving, possessive eyes. He needed to own it, to get closer to God. It was so new and perfectly imperfect, so chosen, just as he was. They belonged together. He made a decision. His eyes never breaking from the child's, he dashed up the aisle, thinking quietly but unaware that his lumbering footfalls echoed mushily through the stone walls. The mother turned just in time to see John's ox-like visage loom up in front of her as he took the googling child in his ham fists. Frozen and senseless ununderstanding, her mind finally told her what was happening, and she screamed as she ran after him. John had never run before, and was not good at it. The fear of this house, of a wrathful God washing over him. He felt the child's mother on his back, ripping at his face and eyes with her fingernails. Like a frightened bull, he kicked at her behind him, throwing her onto the pews, not hearing the resounding snap of her spine as it ripped apart. Her screams of agony and despair filled the church, and the baby in his arms filled John's heart as he raced it outside. As all things come to he who waits, the curtain of night fell over the city. John stepped out of the shadows and into the moonlit park, still cradling the baby in his arms. He loved his child, tickled it under the chin, and the babe chuckled with glee and drooled on his finger. John stuck the wet finger in his mouth, savoring the newness. He sat on the earth under a huge tree, the baby in his lap, and rocked back and forth, basking in the moonlight. From the center of the park, the lights of the city seemed a million miles away. They were surrounded by trees and brush and clean black air. As they smiled at one another, John could feel the beating of the child's tiny heart. He unbuttoned his shirt just to feel this living thing against his skin. It was so warm, so alive, so foreign. Where hairless flesh touched flesh, there was a sheen of sweat. He slid the baby across his stomach like running a pat of butter over a hot skillet. As he held the child against him, it tried to suckle his sizable breast. He let it. John looked from the baby's face to the face of the moon. To him, they were the same. They both reflected God. They were both his handiwork. The child was the seed, and John knew he must plant the seed. He removed a shoe and dug through the new dew into the soft soil at the base of the tree. He would plant the seed and give it nourishment, and in its place would grow a tree. He would tend God's tree, and it would reach high up into the heaven and finally up to God himself, and John would climb that tree and sit at God's feet with Angela and give him all his love. Sweat began to drip from his hairless brow as he continued to dig, the child now asleep in his lap. The hole for the seed grew as the sole came off his shoe, but it was big enough. John laid the child in the dirt, and as he began to fill the hole over with dirt, the baby, for the first time, began to cry. He patted the soil into place, muffling the cries that he couldn't hear anyway, lovingly planting his gift to God. Removing his clothing to stand naked over his gift in the moonlight, he could not hear the voices shouting at him. But they were only words, only men's words, and it wouldn't have mattered to him. He didn't hear the frantic warnings through the bullhorn. He didn't even turn when the policeman fired a warning shot over his head. He was too busy offering his gift to acknowledge mere mankind. So the bullets took him by surprise. He felt the fist of God rip through his heart, and saw the geyser of blood explode from his chest and rain down on the newly planted soil. He felt one useless ear ripped from the side of his head and was glad God had chosen to take it. He smiled as he collapsed to the earth, blood dumping from the cavity where his heart used to be, propelled by its ghost rhythm. He saw his life spill onto the soil and watched capillary attraction draw it down to fertilize the mewling, muffled seed that lay crying underneath. As the blue men rushed to his monument to unearth the baby, John never even saw them. As his vision went dark, his spirit went bright. Moonlight glinted off his toothy grin as his corporeal body emptied itself of life at the base of the tree. Before being completely enveloped in night's cowl, the John in his head climbed hand over hand up its branches to sit with Angela at the feet of their creator. But he never got there. There was no there to get. And somebody turned off the moon.